Today is Friday, September the 9th, in 2016. My name is Louise Stern, and it is my honor and my privilege today to interview Ellen Bromley for the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. Good morning, Ellen.
Good morning,
and
Louise.
welcome. Thank you for
very
joining
much.
us.
Thank
Okay.
Ellen, would you just tell us your name for the record?
Yes, my name is Ellen Epstein Bromley.
Okay. And where and when were you born, Ellen?
Okay, I was born in Stamford on June 10th, 1953 in Stamford Hospital. My parents were Paula Epstein and Sid Epstein. My father had been born here also in 1923, and my mother was an immigrant from the Bronx.
Okay. And how about your grandparents?
My Epstein grandparents lived here from the early 1900s on, 1920 maybe, on. My grandpa had a moving business, Stamford Storage. It was storage and moving. And my grandmother kept the books for him for some time, and then when he retired, she actually went to work for the state of Connecticut as an assistant in the probate office. My grandpa was a Russian immigrant, my grandmother was British, and they met when my grandfather was traveling through England on his way to fight in Palestine
Wow.
with Ben Gurion. So he had come to Canada from Russia and then actually circled back to Palestine via England, where he met my grandma, came back after fighting in the...
Did you say your grandma?
My grandma Epstein, Ray Epstein, was British, and he brought her back from London to Stamford, where they set up this little business and had 3 children.
So what about your parents? Where did they live in Stamford?
I want to say one thing about my other grandparents, even though they're
okay.
not Stamford people. My grandmother, actually, my mother's parents, Rose and Sid Goldenberg, were from the Bronx, and after my grandpa died, my grandmother came here and lived her last 20 some odd years in Stamford. Before that, my grandfather, my mother's father, Sid Goldenberg, had been one of the original founders of UJA.
Wow.
And there's a connection between my parents on that issue, which I may get to. Okay.
You have real deep history
I
here.
have history and roots. Right.
Okay, and your father, he earned a living in the movie.
So my dad, I know you have an interview of his on tape. You probably have most of this information, but just to keep it consistent, I'll give it to you. My dad went to school, all the way through school here. Franklin School, Burdick, and Stamford High, all the schools that I followed him to 30 years later. I was somewhat more successful in school than he was, perhaps definitely not as successful in life so far. My father started, he was a Depression baby basically. He was born in 23. So all through the 30s, when life was really tough, he helped my grandpa in his small moving business. My father always told stories about being able to drive at about age 10 and just helping out, generally speaking. In high school, he actually ended up taking his senior year basically out of school to help. My grandpa had a problem with the business, and my father had to help him run the business for a year.
While he was in high school.
Well, yes, graduated from high school, went to the war, came back to Stamford and worked still for this small trucking business until they went out of business, and then my father moved on to much more interesting places.
So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Okay, well, yeah, it's sort of interesting. So I always teased my dad. He was in the Army Air Corps, and he was a really bright guy, and he kept getting recommended to do things that bright kids get recommended for, officer training school and things like that. And he always turned them down. He was he saw himself, I guess, as a man of the people in some way. And I always teased him. I said, Dad, you were the only Jewish kid in the world who got out of the Army and didn't go to college on the GI Bill. And he didn't. He didn't go to college. I'm going to digress for a minute because education, it turned out, was very important to him. And of course, my sister and I grew up knowing we would go to college. And then sometime after college, I had already been out of school and working, and I said to my dad one day, I'm thinking I'm going to law school. I was on my own, I was married, I had a job. My father said, that's a great idea, I'll pay. And he did, and I went to law school. I want to say about 10 years after that, and by then I'm a grown woman with children, probably living back in Stamford, and I said, law might not have been the thing for me. I'm thinking maybe I'll go to business school. My father said, where do I sign the check? I didn't go to business school, but he had a reverence for education, even though he had none of his own. That said, he was really bright. So when his little business went out of business, he went to work in New Rochelle for a family-owned moving business called Neptune. And the only problem with that family-owned business was it wasn't his family. So he was really, as he rose through the ranks in terms of prestige and knowledge and ability to manage the business, it still wasn't a really great job financially. In those days, and we're talking about the 50s and 60s, the trucking industry was very regulated. And in order to get permission to haul, they were household goods movers mostly. In order to get permission to haul goods on a route, you'd have to go through this complicated process of getting permission from the Interstate Commerce Authority, Washington agency. And you'd have to testify, almost like the airlines do it now, where you can't fly any route. You have to, the routes are regulated. My father became an industry expert. So although he was in this little family moving company in New Rochelle, New York, he was pretty well known nationally in his industry. The other thing he had, which was, I always want to cry when I say this, because my father had a remarkable personality. He just had a politician's instinct. He knew what to say, how to say, who to say it to, and what not to say. Just that kind of perfect timing and just intuitive intelligence along with actual intelligence. So for Neptune, he was, while he was getting national prominence on this legal stage, let's say, he also became the person who did the union contracts on behalf of management for Neptune. So he had a really good rapport with other management people and with labor.
So that's a wonderful segue for my next question, which was, what was their involvement in politics and community service?
Well, I'm going to backtrack.
Okay.
So what happened was, after many years of being at this company, Allied Van Lines, which was probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest van line in the country, ended up looking for ultimately a president, and they did a national search. And my dad, who hadn't gone to college on the GI Bill, who had practically not graduated from high school, who insisted his children get an education, ended up being president of Allied Van Lines. And he always tells the story. He was bright and he was a reader, and he was okay on that side of the business. He was weak in numbers and stuff you'd actually learn in school. And he always says on the first day of work, he said he called in the head of the accounting department. He said, listen, I'm going to tell you a secret. I'm not going to tell anybody, but you're going to have to teach me how to do these, write reports, read reports, write annual reports. And I'm sure he didn't tell you that.
That's great. It really is. So tell me something. What was your dinner table conversation like?
At home?
Uh-huh.
Well, my dinner conversation at home as a child really consisted of, as it did in the 50s for so many people, a mother and two children, because my dad went to work early in the morning and came home late at night. But it was current eventsy. I mean, there's a culture that we're part of where events
How about your
at the
mother?
time.
Was she involved in things?
Yeah, my mother was politically interested. She had been, I would say my father was probably more middle of the road, not, ultimately affiliated with Democrats, although he had registered as a Republican as a youth, as he always told it, to aggravate his father, who was a Russian socialist. But they were Democrats, so our conversation was, fairly left-leaning, although my dad definitely had an authoritarian kind of streak to him. So he didn't like disrespect of anything. So now you go into the 60s when people were protesting in ways that might have seemed risky to my father in some way. He was very risk averse, and he would never wanted us to participate in a protest where there could be a camera. And I remember coming home once from college and saying, you know, maybe I'm on J. Edgar Hoover's enemies list, and that he didn't like that idea. So.
Yeah, I could see that. Okay, and you talked about law school, but where did you go to college?
So I went to college. I graduated. I went first 2 years to Simmons College in Boston, then I transferred to Duke University in North Carolina. Two very different experiences.
I would say so.
Both interesting and good. And then after that, I went to Georgetown Law. After that, my ex-husband and I moved from Durham to Washington, D.C. I worked on Capitol Hill for 2 years.
Before law school?
Before law school, and then went to law school.
Was that your incentive for going to law school? That experience?
I guess you'd have, probably. Law school was something I'd always thought about. Working on the Hill was something I loved. But I really sort of saw it as not enough of a future. I thought law school would help me with my future if we stayed in D.C. and progressed in politics. But we didn't.
What?
But we didn't stay in D.C. We thought we'd stay in D.C., my husband and I. We had our first 2 children were born there.
In Washington?
In Washington.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And how did your education influence your political views in other ways that you know, other than your thinking about protesting?
Actually, I wouldn't even so much say political views. What happened is I came back to Stanford in 1982 with 2 little kids. My husband had a job here, and I got involved. My kids weren't, they were in the one was in the nursery school here, one was a baby. And I think at the time in Stanford they were talking about redistricting that would have affected my neighborhood. It was the neighborhood that went to Newfield School.
Ellen, what neighborhood was that?
I lived on Idlewood Place in Pepperidge.
Oh.
And I got involved opposing the redistricting. And I'm trying to remember what the impetus for that was, but I ended up doing the testifying down at the Board of Ed. And I like to talk. I hope I'm coming across clear now. And that caught the attention of a couple of people, including somebody else who I'm sure you've interviewed, Sandy Goldstein. Sandy Goldstein was on the Board of Reps from the same local district that I lived in, the 16th district, and she needed a running mate.
Oh.
And I guess it was the following year she said, would you be my running mate? So.
Was this when she ran for mayor?
No, this was before that. This was in 1985. Actually, I'll tell you, this is a little bit of a funny story of some historic, a little bit of interest. So we started the campaign, the election was in November 1985, so the campaign was in the summer of 85, and I was pregnant. I had a baby that was born 4 weeks after the election, and typically in those days, these days, any days, when you do politics, especially local, you go door to door and you meet your neighbors and you say why you want them to vote for you. And Sandy, so I was maybe 32 at the time, she was probably 42, thereabouts. You're welcome. She said, you know what, you do the calling, I'll do the walking, because if people see that you're pregnant, they might not vote for you, because they might say, why isn't she going to be home with her children? And I remember saying, come on, I think that's over. And she said, no, I don't think that is all the way over. And that, when you think about it, we've come a really long way. That's 30 years ago. So as everybody who knows Sandy Goldstein does, I did what she said.
That's for sure.
And I made my calls while she did the walking, and we won handily, and that's how I ended up in local politics.
Okay. And who were your political heroes when you were growing up?
Growing up? I'd sort of have to say Hubert Humphrey. And I'm going to only say that because by the time I was conscious enough to participate in a political campaign, he was the guy running for president. And I remember going downtown to what is now actually right behind the government center. The Democratic headquarters that year were in this little building. There used to be a music school, Tartell's, and then, you know, a little row of buildings that are now going to be the Yukon dorms. Is that right? Well, right there anyway. And so I can't say if he was exactly my hero, but he was the first person I really remember
So you campaigned
for.
Mm-hmm.
It was a long time ago.
And after
I was
that?
in high school. Local or national?
Both.
You know, locals is sort of funny. I guess this is going to be a little bit of a surprise because I ended up on the board of reps for a couple of terms, and then my husband and I moved to North Stamford, so I resigned, and then I ran again up there, and I ended up on it for a couple of other terms. In the meantime, I started practicing law more and more seriously. In the early years, I had part-time jobs doing title searches and other things you could do part-time, sort of, you know, drop off kids, do a job, pick up kids, that kind of thing. But eventually, I went to work for a big law firm called Schatz and Schatz, Rubenkoff and Kotkin, and it was very long hours and pretty hard work and very interesting. But I had 3 little kids. It was really too much for me. So I'm getting to...
Yeah.
So Dan Malloy, who had been somebody I'd known from Herod, had just been elected mayor of Stamford, and I went to see him and I said, hey, look, you know, I'm willing to offer you, you know, my great, wonderful skill at a discount rate because I really need to have some control over my hours. And he didn't have exactly the job I wanted as civil service, but anyway, I ended up being hired for by the city in a predecessor job to what I have now, social services director. And it was really a housing job. It was the time when we were rebuilding affordable housing in a big way all over town. So that was the job. Dan Malloy, in the following way, is my hero. I like this story a lot. I'm very opinionated, I'm very strong, I'm intelligent, I'm educated, and I'm not shy. So one day he asked me a question. He said, I'm going to do such and such. I forget what it was. And I did the research. I came back the next day. I said, Dan, I don't think you should do that. I think you're going to get in trouble this way, and this way if you do it. And he came back with another. He said, no, I think I'm going to do it because this. I came back the next day. I'm like, listen, I've been thinking about this again. I really don't think you should do that thing. Go again. The next time I did it, he looked at me and he said, Ellen, he said, look, he said, I appreciate what you're doing. I understand. He said, but I'm the mayor. He said, and I'm going to do it my way. And then he said, and if there's a consequence, I will take the consequence. And in a way, and I'm 63 years old, I've had a lot of experiences. In a way, that sentence is a sentence that stays with me often when I think about leadership.
Okay. Well, you know, that's really interesting because my next question was, when and how did you get into politics, and how did you accomplish getting into politics? So you kind of
checked.
We kind of covered that. And so you want to just amplify the party that you belong to and why?
Okay. Well, I'm a Democrat.
Yeah.
And I was in and out in the sense that I went to work for the city in 1997 and I've worked for politicians, but I'm not actually in politics anymore. In that sense, although, you know, government, in a funny way, I think most people who get into politics probably are initially more interested in government. So I'm doing things I've been able often to work on thinking of and implementing policies that people think of as political, but it really is government. And you know, one had to do with designing a system of senior transportation in Stamford. I've gotten to work on issues that I think are important. Affordable housing.
Okay. You're still working on that.
Mm-hmm.
And are you working on transportation also?
It's time for us to do a new transportation survey. One thing government's particularly bad at, I guess, is planning.
Well, I know we got a survey.
Did you?
Yeah.
Do you know from whom?
I think it was in the paper, and then we followed up on it.
We'll have to talk about that.
So do you have, is that yours?
No. No. Right now, I'm in the planning stage of planning for how to try to analyze what's coming in the next 20 years with seniors in the community. I'm looking for some help, actually, some people who are strategic planning experts, which I'm not, to try to bifurcate, this is sort of off topic, but to try to bifurcate something that we've talked about in big terms for 50 years as seniors into meaningful subgroups to start doing some planning. And those subgroups would have to do with age. Basically, the 1960s programs, which we're still living by, the Older Americans Act, start you out at senior status at about 62, and doesn't distinguish between what you're entitled to and eligibility and its assumptions on need by age at all. So that, for example, I know the JCC here has a senior nutrition, has status as a senior nutrition site, which means under the Older Americans Act, there's a hot meal offered here every day to any senior for a suggested contribution. And that program's a leftover from 1960-something, where senior nutrition was seen as a big issue, and the age of the population was seen as significantly poorer than the rest of the population. But that means that I am 63, as are your children, and that means all of us could come here comfortably for lunch any day, and with our $3 contribution, which somebody's going to subsidize, get that lunch. And program, it's very, very hard to redo programs like that. And I think in a way, not to go real philosophical on you, but that's sort of what we saw in the lead up to this current election, that it's time to take a real deep look.
Yeah, besides here at the JCC, I think you have something at the government center also.
There are 4 sites in Stanford, I believe there used to be 5. There's one, the cafeteria at the senior center, in the government center is one, and you get the tickets in the senior center. One here, Quintar Terrace, which is a subsidized senior living building.
Yeah.
And I think the Over 60s Club also, the Over 60 Club also is a nutrition site now.
Where is that?
I think it's meeting down at St. Maurice's.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned you were on the board of reps. Were you on any other, first of all, how long were you on the board of reps?
For about 8 years. 4 years from the 16th district and 4 from the 20th.
It's a pretty long time.
It was long enough to learn
Yeah.
a lot. I was on the board of reps when we bought the government center, which was pretty exciting.
Yeah. And what years were that?
I was first elected in '85, and then I moved out of my district at the end of '88, so '89 almost. And then I filled a vacancy in the 20th in '91, and I stopped running in '95, I guess. Well, I want to say 3, but I bet maybe more like 7 years.
So after that, you haven't had any elective office? You weren't in any elective office?
No, I never ran
Yeah,
again.
right, okay. And can you tell us, I mean, you've told us a little bit about your mentors, but can you tell us a little bit more about one or more of your mentors? And how that worked and how...
And nothing formal. I mean, in a funny way, I'd have to say my dad was my best mentor.
Okay.
I said to him, I was lucky. He lived to be.
Was he in politics at all?
No, just he was the most natural politician I know, but no, never ran for anything.
Right. Okay. And Ellen, who were your supporters
when I ran?
Yeah.
My neighbors, friends and
Okay.
neighbors. So after that first campaign, when I didn't go knocking on doors, I did knock on doors every other time I ran, and I loved it, and just...
You did?
Loved it. Totally loved it. We talk about that sometimes, people who run for office, that some of us love it and some of us don't.
When you were on the board of reps, Dan Malloy was not involved, or he was?
Well, I'll tell you, Dan Malloy was on the board of finance when I was on the board of reps. David Martin, who's the current mayor, was on the board of reps with me, and David and his wife Judy became my best personal friends, and this goes back 30 some odd years. We met when we were kids. I had 2 kids, they had none. Then the next year we each had a baby, and since then, we've been best friends. I mean, our kids have grown up together. We celebrate Jewish holidays together. We go on vacations together. So it's actually been an interesting turn in life to end up having now. So now I work for the mayor, who is also a friend, which one might need a mentor to negotiate that relationship.
So what were some of the obstacles that you faced, as you got into politics, and how did you overcome them?
What kind of obstacles? I mean,
Well, did you have any? Let's put it that way.
well,
Part of what you were saying sounded like it was rather a natural progression, but
it was a natural progression, and to the extent that an issue is an obstacle, hard work helps you overcome
Right.
or arrive at some kind of compromise.
Well, how about with the redistricting? How did you accomplish what you wanted to do there?
That redistricting we held off basically. That's so long ago, but what had happened is the Board of Ed had announced a redistricting at the same time that development was occurring on Strawberry Hill Avenue across from Agudith. And they hadn't accounted for where they were going to put the children in that were going to live in those houses. So we basically said, hold off for a year till you see what you have, because the same schools you're talking about moving kids to and from will be the natural home for these children, so why don't you see what you have before you move forward. And that's what happened. But I realized after that, and I think this would almost always be true, that things like redistricting are emotional for the people affected, but from a point of integrity, not something I'd ever really want to be opposing again, if just for political reasons, because things have to change. I hope that's articulate enough, but a lot of people get into politics by getting a name, by being against something and winning a fight, which was essentially what happened then. And then everybody on my Newfield School PTA knew me and loved me and wanted to vote for me, and that was fine. But for the good of the whole, redistrictings have to happen, rezonings have to happen. So it's a little bit different being in government than being in politics. And the challenge, I don't know that you would talk about overcoming any one obstacle, but the challenge is always being as good and as thorough and as constant a communicator as you can be, and just, movement
In both, actually.
has to happen.
Yeah.
More slowly than one might hope, but
So you mentioned that you liked campaigning.
loved it.
Okay. How'd you raise money?
Well, I ran in small races. So when you run in a local district, you're running with your neighbors and friends. It's not a particularly, in those days, it wasn't a particularly expensive election. You needed some money to send out a mailer, so you needed money for stamps and maybe some printing, and usually you had a friend who would do take the pictures for you,
Right,
and
okay.
that kind of stuff. So it wasn't a very expensive proposition. The other thing that happened to me, and because I was local, and it's an interesting point, when I came back to Stanford in 1982, so I left to go to college in 71, came back 11 years later, and it was a different city. I mean, the mall was new, the Landmark building was up, things had changed. I came here with my 3-year-old. And the first call I probably made on the Monday morning after I moved was to Sarah Walker to say, can I get her in camp and can I get her in nursery school? And there was no room in the camp, but we got her into the nursery school. And I came to the nursery school, and none of the moms were people I knew. Your daughter wasn't there, your son wasn't there, none of the parents. They were all people who were new to town, mostly people who were new to town.
Did you go to the nursery?
My sister did.
Huh?
My sister did.
Yeah.
I went to Longridge School nursery school.
Okay.
Then, right about the same time, like just slightly after that, is when I started to get involved in these local politics. Now I end up going down to Board of Reps meetings or Board of Ed meetings to testify. And all of the people down there were people either I knew, or my father knew, or my grandmother knew, or some. So it was like very, very interesting to have been part of the Jewish community at that time, because, and you can sort of see it here too. And if you look at the names on the walls, we've had a big influx, and politically in Stamford, David Martin, our current mayor, is the first mayor we've ever had that wasn't born here. So it took another 35 years for that to start to happen in Stamford. And I just say start because I'm not sure where Stamford is on that. So that was interesting. But the supporter part was easy. The first time I ran for the Board of Reps, and this segues to that. I went through what we call the voter book, and I looked at all the names of the people who lived in my district. And I wrote down the phone numbers, and it turned out I could count enough people, I think it was 700 or 800 people, that either I knew from having gone through schools here, or my sister, they had friends who were my friends, my sister's friends, my parents' friends, my grandparents' friends. So I have to say, even though I was really,
So a lot of them were in your district.
really nervous about running every time,
Yeah.
I pretty much figured, unless they hated Paula, Sidney, Julie, and Ellen, I was probably going to win. And that's what happened.
And do you remember what you spent? When you campaigned?
Probably a couple $1,000. Probably a couple $1,000, but I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
Not much.
And when you were running, were you involved in debates at all?
No.
No?
No.
But on the Board of Reps, you were. And what were some of the memorable ones?
I'll tell you, first, the one thing I do remember, and I didn't say a word on the Board of Reps for the first year. That was memorable to me, because that was not typical. I spent the first year really listening and the issues repeated themselves. Basically the board is a legislative and a fiscal board, so the fiscal process repeats itself each year. The first issue I remember being involved in, it was really a learning experience, was purchasing ordinance. So we had a purchasing scandal right about that time. The mayor at the time, Mayor Serrani, had our 911 emergency system, I may have this a little bit wrong, but this is the gist, needed to be replaced. And Serrani was a tech geek, if you will. He wanted to replace it with the state-of-the-art kind of system. The Board of Reps, which sort of, as I just said to you, was, I didn't say it was filled with old Stanfordites, but it was also filled with people from Stanford, many of whom were old Stanfordites. And Stanford was sort of a changing community, and they did not appropriate money for a state-of-the-art emergency system. And Serrani went ahead and in some way violated what he was supposed to do, purchased something more expensive and fancier than what he was supposed to, and there were all kinds of allegations of corruption around that, and truthfully, I'm not sure I ever really bought them. But to get back to the question, this is why I never really went further. I talk too much. To get back to the question, the piece of legislation I remember being involved in initially was to write a purchasing ordinance so that the levels of authority for what you could do with certain, at certain levels of expenditure changed. You could do certain things without a lot of permission and oversight. If you're just spending a little money, you'd have to have more oversight. If it's a lot, you'd have to have certain approvals if it was more than that. And that was a reaction to this scandal. That I remember, and it was very.
So you were successful in that.
Well, yeah, me and everybody else who wrote it. Actually, David Martin, Bill McManus, who was a Republican, it was a bipartisan effort. David was a Democrat. Bill McManus, me, Maria Naki.
He was involved in this.
David, yeah. Yes, and he had a business background, so he and a man named Bill McManus, who also was involved for many years after that, he was a Republican. They brought their professional MBA backgrounds to this endeavor. Mm-hmm. It was interesting. That's probably the first issue I remember being involved in that went beyond something I was familiar with. It wasn't really political. It was really a business thing.
Well, yeah, it was, but it also involved politics.
Correct.
Yeah. And so you obviously, what I wanted to ask you was how did you do? But obviously you did well because you got it all passed.
And to this day that is still the ordinance. It's been amended a few times. Probably could be amended again. It's lugubrious. Is that the word? It's a very, when people complain that it's slow at the city, it's the checks and balances of that ordinance make purchasing extremely slow, city purchasing, and it's probably time to look at some, I don't know that, but just I'm thinking in terms of computer and other ways of getting information, checking off, you've done things with integrity. It probably could be quickened in some way. But I haven't thought
So
about
is updating an ongoing process?
not as ongoing as it should be.
Okay.
Every once in a while somebody takes a look at the ordinances and tries to work through some improvements, but in professional staff, the city is short-staffed, and on volunteer time,
Do you have many volunteers?
I mean, the boards of reps and finance are all volunteers, so depending on how much time and expertise those elected people have, you do get new ordinances from time to time. They're working on a really extensive animal ordinance, which I don't know anything about, but I know it's been taking a very long time to.
Well, you mentioned that you got involved because of redistricting. That was one of the issues. And then you mentioned the purchasing scandal. What were some of the other main issues when you were on the Board of Reps, when you first got it on and as the years continued?
Sewers. So because we run in local districts, interests of local importance prevail. And in the 16th district, which is right over here, so we're on corner of Vine and Newfield, the 16th, I think it still is the 16th, we do redistrict, slightly every 10 years, is that area, the Pepperidge area, so just west and south of here. And there were small lots with failing septic systems, and actually that same district crossed Longridge Road over to Castlewood. So that for the whole time I was on the board in that district, each year, a different sewer project was something we lobbied for so that our constituents could get sewers and they wouldn't have failing septic systems. So that was one issue that we were always involved in. I mean, they're very pedestrian. They're not necessarily the burning national issues of our time, but local government. Zoning, accessory zoning, yeah.
Okay.
I could say that and finish this because that I could predict that is an issue, and I don't know what will happen in Stamford. So when sometime right around that era, I don't know if you remember this, somebody had proposed accessory zoning in Stamford, and I don't know if it went across all zones or not, but it definitely would have affected this small half acre and less zone down in my district. And basically accessory zoning lets you have an accessory use to your house. So you and your single family house could have basically a little apartment on that house with a separate door and separate entrance. It went down in flames in Stamford. I think I may have this wrong. If I thought of it, I would have prepared for this. I think the zoning board approved it, and then in Stamford there's you can appeal a zoning regulation to the Board of Reps, and the Board of Reps turn that thing down real fast. And it's never come up again. Every time it's raised, sort of theoretically in terms of a housing problem, which we do have, people say, oh no, it'll never fly in Stamford. It turned out, I think sometime around that time, I had asked somebody about the issue itself, and I think there's an accessory zoning reg in Weston, and I think in some other places where all the housing is 1 to 2 acre zoning. Okay, so the big opposition here was in these neighborhoods, and justifiably, if you're going to add, people and cars and traffic and on these little teeny streets, you're going to have a real problem. Now, think I said in the very beginning, so we'll come full circle. You're facing an issue of I call it a tsunami of aging baby boomers.
Mhm.
It's definitely the kind of issue you want to think about again. You want to revisit. You want to sort of get a sense of what numbers we're talking about, what people are expecting, how we could make something like that work. You know, you talk about aging in places of a buzz people use.
Mhm.
Well, that would include, I think, at least looking at something like this. If you looked at it, you know, you'd want the leadership, you'd want to be able to introduce it in a way that makes some sense. So maybe you would limit it to a 1 acre or 2 acre zone. And maybe the people in that zone would be perfectly happy. My husband and I are now 63, we're living in North Stamford, we're planning on living in that house for a long time. I don't know that we would object to something like that for ourselves or for our neighbors. Why would we care? But so those are the kinds of issues that really interest me.
Yeah.
But you need some
Well,
strategic help with them.
Yeah. The only thing is, it's having 2 acre zoning kind of helps that out, but it's in the smaller areas where it's needed. You know, they're the ones that need to have the aging parents living with them.
Maybe. It's something that needs to be researched. It could be that the aging people who still live in North Stamford may want to have a younger student living with them. I don't know. But that's the kind of issue that really interests
Yeah.
me.
Well,
Should be looked
they're
at.
becoming more and more vital, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, how about civil rights? Were you involved in that at all? In that?
I love it. Only in the way that everybody I know was. It's almost like I remember watching the March on Washington on my grandfather's lap. My mother's parents had a summer home. We used to spend the summer with them in Mahopac, New York. And I can remember my grandpa calling me in and saying, "Come here, you got to see this," and putting me on his lap. I was 10 years old, and explaining everything. You know, how important it was and how right it was. So involved in what, you know, involved in the way that it's part of my DNA. I can't remember doing anything special other than supporting, you know, any kind of civil rights.
But it surrounded your family life.
It surrounded my family
Yeah.
life. It surrounded my best friend had been in a marriage, and she left her marriage for another woman, and they were my best friends. I mean, civil rights in every sense was just kind of in my DNA. None of it mattered. I mean, I never understood why anyone was against any of it. Exactly. I mean, I do understand. I'm not stupid in that way, but.
Okay, when you were involved in your term of office, was there a big issue at all about taxes?
Always.
And how did that work out
Always.
with your involvement with it?
I always supported whatever the budget was. And usually the issue about taxes in the city has to do with the schools, and I was always a big supporter of the schools, so I was always a big supporter of funding the schools to the best. And, you know, even now, I mean, given the current national campaign, I've started to say to people who I think might even be tempted to not vote for the person I'm voting for, so who do you think should pay for the roads? Your cleaning lady? I mean, you know, we have an obligation to pay taxes.
And what about unions? Were you involved? I mean, with your business, with involvement with housing, are you dealing with unions? And how does that affect what you're doing if you are?
Not particularly involved. In all honesty, that's probably another area where it's time to take a closer look at the good and the harm of them.
And urban renewal, does that fit into your picture?
No, not really.
Yeah.
I that's something I actually never vote. If ever an urban renewal issue came before the board when I was on it, I abstained because my grandpa had, the small trucking firm he had in Stamford was located on West Park Place eventually. And that building was part of the URC plan.
Oh.
And now, after, I want to say 60 years, there's finally building going on that site. But it was a source of great frustration to my family for many years. So I abstained.
Okay. And were there any other things that you want to talk about? You know, with regard to the issues that were going on in your term of office?
Not really. I mean, the thing that happened during my term of employment that I think has been most significant has to do with the rebuilding of affordable housing in Stamford, rebuilding of subsidized housing in Stamford. Mm-hmm. What had happened is the projects people know, Southfield Village and Fairfield Court, had gotten run down and really condemnable in terms of municipal health codes. And the Malloy administration, and I was their liaison to the Housing Authority and other housing interests, really was very influential in getting funding in to rebuild these communities as what we call mixed income communities, so that they're affordable to not just the poorest of the poor people, but sort of up the income scale to something like median, a variant. Somebody earning at their half of the area median might be eligible. So the idea is to get the rent rolls up a little bit better so that they can be self-sustaining. And the way they had been conceived of in the 30s and 40s when they were built was very low rent. Well, if you have very low rent, no other subsidy, you never have enough money in the project to keep it healthy. So the projects have been designed somewhat better. And of course that has caused an unintended consequence of we have lost housing for very, very poor people in Stamford, and that's being addressed in different ways now.
Well, one of the things that I
That's a huge
always
problem.
was wondering was, where did the people go? Did they stay in Stamford or did they move away?
Well, that's too big a question for an easy answer. I'll give you one answer. It would be Southfield Village originally had like 500 and some odd apartments. A couple hundred were in high-rise buildings and 300 were in low-rise buildings. The high-rise buildings were condemned by the health department like in 1995. What the law says, federal and state, is anytime government action causes a forfeiture, a condemnation, you have to compensate the people. It's the same as a taking. You take property for a road, you have to pay for your house. So the tenants in those buildings, those two high-rise buildings, got what they call Section 8 vouchers. And Section 8 voucher, you can take it to any landlord and rent your apartment. What happens, not to complicate things, but I say any apartment, but that's not true. Any apartment with a rent at fair market value. So think 1995, 6, 7. As they got these vouchers, housing prices in Stamford escalated. So in what was an unintended consequence, many of these people were unable to spend their vouchers in Stamford and did move up the line a little bit to Bridgeport. Ultimately, when they did the rest of the rehab, the vouchers people were given. So some people were promised the right of return, and they got that. I mean, they were entitled to under those rebuilding programs. And other people got vouchers, and in the next waves they were able to spend those vouchers in Stamford. And it's been really interesting.
So, Ellen, what were some of the proudest moments in your career?
I think helping achieve that rebuild of our stock of affordable housing.
Yeah, well, that was huge.
It was huge.
Yeah.
And it took, I want to say, the bulk of my time for a very long time. And then I also, coincident with that, I'm the person, if you call the government center with any housing issue, you're liable to end up on the other end of my phone. So I'm also very happy to be able to give people really good advice and, including landlords, by the way, including landlords.
You mean, when you say people good advice, you're talking about your clients?
Well, I don't have clients, I'm constituents, good solid advice. I mean, you know, if you're a tenant who is being treated a certain way by a landlord, and you call me, and I'm able to give you what, either the advice that says what they're doing is well within their rights, or the advice that says this is what you need to do. And I think I save people a lot of aggravation, and I save a lot of people who can't afford to go to a lawyer the need to go to a lawyer. And that would be true of landlords and tenants, quite frankly. Because a lot of, you know, you forget in, well, probably any place, a lot of our landlords are also little guys who ended up owning homes who now they're renting, you know, and they don't know all the rules either. And, you know, what I explain to them is, you know, if a tenant doesn't pay the rent, this is what you have to do, and do it this way because there's a balance. And if you do it in the way that the law provides, you'll get your unit back without very much, if any, loss of money. But often what happens, and that's sort of way beyond what anyone's going to ever want to hear, is, you know, if you're a small landlord and you have a tenant who's not paying, you let it go on for 3 months, and then you try to evict them, you're going to lose 5 months' rent. But if you do it under the law, even if you feel sorry for them, you can always back off your eviction. If you bring your eviction the first day the rent's not there, you can always withdraw the eviction. But if you're holding security in the last month's rent, and you do it the right way, you're not going to lose any money either. And that's sort of a hard thing to say, but our landlords are not all big corporate landlords. They're guys who are depending on that income for their livelihoods. So I'm proud. I'm proud of the work I do for people.
Well, I can see that you would be. You should be.
I am.
I mean, that's really important, and I can see what a role that plays. You know, both with the landlord and the tenant.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so that's really something to be proud of. But what about regrettable moments? Do you have any?
Regrettable moments. They're all personal. No. Business-wise, I'm okay.
Okay. Well, you talked a little bit about early on, you know, the Jewish involvement, and I'm wondering, was that a help or a hindrance throughout your political career?
I don't know. I'm giggling because there was a guy in Stanford, there's Lawrence Different named Bob Bromley, and he had a mother named Helen Bromley, and they weren't Jewish. They were just Bromleys, not a Bromwitz Bromleys. And when I ran for the Board of Reps the first time, I think Helen Bromley, who's probably be 110 now if she were alive, maybe more, had been the first woman on the Board of Reps in Stanford a long time before that. And as I called my name, I think she had lived on Cedar Heights Road, which was in my district, and as I would call, because I was calling, not walking, remember, people would say, "Are you related to Helen Bromley?" And I would say, "No, but I know her son Bob," and that would be the end of that. But so I don't know if that's responsive to your question, but my guess is they didn't expect me to be Jewish. I'm not sure anyone cared.
Right. Okay.
I mean, I was always active enough in the Jewish community that anyone who did care knew.
And what about your children? Are any of them involved in politics?
Not if I can help it. I shouldn't say that. My youngest daughter, they're not involved in elected politics, and it takes a long time. You know, you get involved in elected politics, you go to these meetings, it sort of becomes a part of your life. The people you meet with become your best friends. And if you're looking to build a career, you're taking a significant amount of time away from building that career. So that was my joke about not if I can help it. My younger daughter, who lives in Troy, New York, works for something called the Sanctuary for Independent Media. So not directly involved in politics, but she's involved in the stuff that politics does.
Right.
And
So are they lawyers?
No, none of my children are lawyers.
Okay. And What legacy do you think you've left behind? I mean, you've talked a lot about, you're giving advice and so on, but are there some other things that you think that you've left behind as a legacy?
Well, as sort of part of a collective legacy, and the story I told when I was carrying the torch, this summer in preparation for the anniversary here, was here at the JCC. Was a few years ago. I had occasion to be here in the JCC, and I hadn't been here for many years. My kids are now 37, 34, and 30, so I hadn't been, I used to be here every day of my life, but I hadn't been in maybe 10 years. And I walked into this building, sort of like today, and I walked through it for whatever reason, and I didn't recognize anyone. And there wasn't a face I knew, there wasn't a kid I knew, there wasn't a teacher I knew, and yet there was like noise and energy and fun in the hall. And I stood by that tree where we had those leaves, and I looked for the leaf that said my name and my kids' names and my ex-husband's name. And I thought, this is great. Look what we built. Look what we helped build. So, no, I don't think there's a legacy where anyone's going to say Ellen Bromley was here.
Right.
I don't think I was that important, but
you were part of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it feels good.
Well, look, we've covered an awful lot of things in this interview.
Yeah, feel free to add.
But is there anything else that you would like to add?
I'd like to say my children's names. I'd like to say my children's names.
Please do.
So my other legacy, Sarah Bromley's side and her husband Steve's side, Matt Bromley and his wife Liz Sunny Bromley, and their son Sydney Bromley, and my daughter Melissa Bromley.
Okay.
That's my legacy.
Okay. And would you have anybody that you would recommend that we would interview?
Let me think about it.
Okay. Well, let us know if you do.
I don't know.
And Ellen, this has been a great interview, and thank you so much for giving us your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
It's been very valuable. Thanks so much.
Thank you. This was fun.